Hello and welcome back to the PNN. This is Parker Taft. Today is day 3 of our 30-day challenge. And today we're doing a story spotlight, a series that I'm starting up and which I hope to continue every Wednesday for the rest of the month. Today we are talking about David and Goliath, that ancient story coming right out of one of the oldest and most popular texts in history, the Holy Bible. So to begin with, I'm pretty sure that most of you probably know what the story of David and Goliath, a small guy walks out and takes down this big giant with a sling, and is often used as a parable for a small force taking on a bigger force and winning. Well, there's more to the story than that, but let's get started, shall we? So here's the basic outline of the story. You have David, a Jewish shepherd, comes out to face Goliath, a giant wielding powerful weapons and clad in armor because no one else in the Israeli army will face him. David stares down Goliath, and during Goliath's gloating, draws out a sling with a stone and hits him on the head with it, causing Goliath to fall. He then rushes up and slays Goliath with Goliath's own sword. You can see him cutting off Goliath's head with a sword in that painting there from the Romantic era. You can see King Saul in the background. So, to place it all in context, this story takes place back in ancient Israel. Well, back then, Israel was split into several smaller kingdoms, but was united under one ostensible king. So you have the state made up of the Philistines. They come from Crete, and are of Greek descent. And they established their city-states along the coastline. You then have the Jewish Israelite communities, which live in the highlands. In between, there's an area called the Shephelah, which consists of various ridges and valleys, which is a very prosperous agricultural and mining region, at least in ancient times. And so the Philistines decided they wanted to expand, according to the Bible, and so marched up into the highlands to defeat the Israelite kingdom and conquer them. So King Saul, the Jewish king, not a lot wanting to have his own kingdom conquered out from underneath him, marched there with his own army to oppose them. When they reached the particular battlefield, they set up on opposing ridgelines with the Israelites on one side and the Philistines on the other, and the valley in between. But neither was willing to necessarily surrender the advantage of the high ground, because they realized that if they went down into the valley, they would have to be attacking uphill at their opposing force. So instead, they just sat and waited and stared at each other. They would deploy into battle formation and then stare at each other, and then at night they would retreat back to their own various camps, and then they would repeat this over and over again. This was actually common throughout the ancient world in terms of military history. There's only very few exceptions, and the Greek Peninsula is actually a good example of this because of the terrain unique to it. But overall, from ancient Egyptians to the ancient Romans, over that millennia to 2 millennia time span, this was actually quite a common occurrence. And in the Middle East, there was this tradition called the Battle of Champions, where both sides would send out a champion to fight to the death, so to speak, and whoever won, the side they represented would be victorious and would take a particular city or town or subjugate the particular people that they were campaigning against. And the army that lost their champion would have to just surrender and lay down their arms. Now, we can all realize in human nature that that was not likely to happen, but the army that lost their champion was also likely to be more demoralized. So you have Goliath, who, according to the Bible, was 6'9" a behemoth by any standards, who goes out into battle as the Philistines' champion and demands that the Israelites send out someone to face him and, fight to the death and resolve this through a championship challenge. You then have David, who was a young shepherd from Bethlehem. Technically, he wasn't even supposed to be at the battle. His father, who was quite old at this time, Jesse, had put him in charge of the family's flocks, and he was one of the youngest of his sons. The 3 oldest brothers had been sent to help Saul in his battle with the Philistines. But David was required to dispatch food and supplies and deliver them to his brothers, because during this time period, soldiers were not paid or compensated. It was more of like a militia for their own self-defense. So they were required to bring their own supplies, their own military equipment, etc. So David goes off to supply his brothers, and when he arrives, the Israelites and Philistines are deploying for battle. So he leaves the supplies with the quartermaster and rushes out to find his brothers to see what's going on. When he hears Goliath's challenge and the Israelite soldiers talking about it and the rewards that a person would receive from King Saul if they defeated him, which consisted of wealth beyond imagine, tax exemption for his family, and the hand marriage of King Saul's daughter, which would make you, by the laws of succession, rightful to claim the throne, which was a big deal. Even in small ancient kingdoms or city-states, that was still a big deal. So David decides to go out and fight Goliath, not only for the fame and fortune, which almost anyone would be primary consideration for most people, but because he is fighting for God, and he believes that God will deliver him victory no matter what, even if he's facing the entire Philistine army alone. This shows a level of dedication and compassion to a cause that is unheard of for the most part today. So he goes out, or says he's going to go out and fight him, and his brothers say he's, being foolish, and that he's just trying to make himself look big and be made a big deal of, but he's never going to win. He's going to end up getting himself killed. And King Saul shares this opinion after listening with his viziers and talking with his generals. He says, "What does this little boy from young man, I should say, from Bethlehem have to offer to the battle? None of my strongest warriors will not go out and face Goliath. How can he?" So David argues that since he's a shepherd, he's used to fighting ferocious and wild animals that are far and above stronger and faster than he is, but he has been able to conquer them because God has delivered them into his hands, and that he has the grace of God that has given him the skills necessary to take down these animals. And he thinks that God's grace will continue forward and help him win the battle against Goliath. So King Saul offers him armor and weapons to fight Goliath, believing that the boy will go out and attempt to fight in an infantryman versus infantryman style. Instead, David finds that these weapons are bulky and not good towards his style of fighting. So instead, he just takes his trusty sling and shepherd's staff and 5 smooth round stones and marches out to meet Goliath. Side note here, during this time period, there were 3 types of soldiers. You have your cavalrymen or charioteers, you have your heavy infantrymen, spears, swords, javelins, and then you have ranged weapons, your artillery, your archers, your slingers. And it was typical, speaking, in a championship battle to send out 2 of the same type. So if you were the opposing side sent out a cavalryman, you would send out a cavalryman. Infantryman, slinger, slinger. So it was very rare for an occurrence to happen where one side would send out a slinger and another side would send out an infantryman. So Goliath was probably taken by surprise in this from a historical context, because he wasn't expecting to be facing a youth who was trained as more of a ranged attack rather than a close-in melee attack. So David goes out to slay Goliath, and it is now believed, because of his exceptional size, that Goliath may have suffered from acromegalia, basically giantism, which made Goliath sluggish to respond to quick actions and severely nearsighted. That's why he says, "Come to me, and I will have your flesh be feasted upon by the birds and the wild animals." They believe that he said that because he couldn't actually see David. He could only hear him and approximate where he was based on sound, and that he had to have David extremely close to him before he could actually fight him. So we'll get back to that in a moment. So another important piece of history is that in this particular region where the battle took place, there's a heavy type of stone, which is about twice the normal density of stone. And so the stones, it's been calculated that with a slinger, which can sling accurately at about 200 meters, that the sling used, with the stones used, which was twice the density of normal rock, as I said previously, had the equivalent stopping powder of a .45 caliber pistol. Quite shocking considering the time period. And basically, according to the Bible at least, David was basically at point-blank range when he struck down Goliath and then slew him with the sword. So that's for the history and the context of the story. How about for the important lessons? So here are a few important lessons that I picked out for you. 1. Giants are not as powerful as they appear. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. This is a bit of an obvious one, highlighted by the story itself, but I still think it's an important one to highlight. So basically, you have Goliath, big, strong, you know, take on anything, and then you have meek, relatively small David, who everyone thinks is going to get crushed, and he doesn't. So, and he had experience dealing with bigger opponents, faster opponents than himself, as acting as a shepherd, fighting off lions and bears and other such things that preyed upon his family's flock. Whereas, Goliath was a soldier from youth and heavily battle trained. They came from different backgrounds, and thus each had their own advantages and disadvantages when entering the battlefield. Another one is a person's heart and soul are just as powerful as a material advantage, if not more so. You have Goliath coming out. He's has a incredibly material advantage. He's physically taller, stronger. Giant shield, sword, spear. He should be able to crush anything in his path. And then you have David, who just comes out in his tunic, his shepherd's staff, 5 round stones in a bag, and a thin piece of leather acting as a sling. And David's commitment and belief in his cause, in this case, the survival of the Israelite nation, and his surrendering to God of all external concerns, gives him the confidence to march out there and defeat Goliath. Whereas Goliath, taking David's appearance as an insult, begins to mock and make fun of David, which leads him to underestimating his opponent and eventually being killed by him. So no matter how many material advantages you have in life, it's how you use it that matters. Instead of using his material advantage, Goliath sat back and mocked, whereas David, who was at a distinct material disadvantage, but had the spirit and the drive, managed to conquer all. Be bigger than your fears. I'm sure that when David marched out there, he had a lot of fear and anxiety about facing a bigger opponent. Be resourceful, make use of what you have already. I think that ties in with the second one. David was given, swords and armor, but he really wasn't used to it. He didn't know how to fight in it. So he made use of the best resources he had and the experiences he had to create an outcome that benefited both himself and his nation. Believe anything is possible, because truly, anything is possible. If a small guy can walk up and knock down a big guy and, defeat him, you can easily start a business or, do something that you think that you can't do at the moment. And don't underestimate your abilities or sell yourself short. David certainly didn't. He was confident that he could defeat Goliath. Everyone else was saying, no, 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 you can't do it. But no, only you know the extent of your abilities and how best you can use them to your own advantage. So that's just a few ideas and points I've drawn from the story of David and Goliath. It's personally one of my favorite stories, and you can find a lot in the history of our planet, both in literature, philosophy, the history itself, political, economic. You can find important life lessons that can help you improve your life as a whole. So, in conclusion, David and Goliath isn't just a religious or children's tale, but a composite of life lessons. We all have it within us to take advantage, to have what it needs to succeed. It just requires the courage and dedication to take action. We all have our own unique advantages and disadvantages. And finally, the past holds many stories and lessons which we can apply to improve our own everyday lives. I want you to focus in on the last one, because the study of the past allows you to take best advantage of the future and forego the mistakes of the past. In conclusion, here's some of the sources I've talked about. There's a really good TED Talk on this by Malcolm Gladwell. He also has a very good book called David and Goliath out there, which is a historical and literary analysis of the David and Goliath story. And then there's a few, links for further reading and how there's tips and other life lessons which I found that people have taken out of the story and which have compiled together into lists and descriptions. So other than that, I think we'll end this episode. I hope you all had a wonderful day. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and consider subscribing to our channel for more content. Update us on how you're doing with your 30-day challenge in the comments below. I hope to see you next time. This is the PNN broadcast signing off.